Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Paul Krueger. I'm the managing editor of the foreign desk of Sueddeutsche Zeitung, which is one of the two major national newspapers in Germany. I'm honored and pleased to moderate that panel, and without any further ado, I'm going to shortly frame the topic that we're going to talk about. You've all seen the program. The panel is entitled Second Nuclear Age ? And I think it's important to put the question mark because that's what we're probably going to discuss in depth this afternoon. I think the question could not be more timely, as we have heard news this morning coming out of the defense ministry here in Seoul that North Korea might be preparing for a fourth nuclear test in the context of President Obama visiting this country on Friday. We have discussions in Europe after President Obama announced the reset button with Russia about disarmament that have been profoundly shaken after the annexation of Crimea in Europe. And we have recent developments in the negotiations with Iran. They're going to get down to drafting a final agreement in mid-May during the next meeting of the P5+1 group with Iran in Vienna. That is set to be on May 13th to 15th. So we have a very timely question. I'm going to briefly introduce the speakers and ask each of them to give us a short introductory statement of about 5 minutes. The first speaker is going to be Dr. Cheng Xiaohe. Hope I pronounced that correctly. Yeah, I tried to learn it yesterday. He's an associate professor at the School of International Studies and deputy director of Center for China's International Strategic Studies at Renmin University. Welcome. We have Ambassador Chung Yungwoo, who does not need an introduction for a Korean audience, but for all others, he has been serving recently as the National Security Advisor to President Lee Myung-bak and is now the senior advisor at the Asan Institute. He has served 33 years at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is impressive to someone who just turned 36. We have Bob Einhorn, who's now a senior fellow with the Arms Control Initiative and the Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence within the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings Institution. He served as a State Department Special Advisor for Non-Proliferation and Arms Control, and I met him in a couple of rather unusual places like Baghdad or Almaty when he was part of the US delegation to the P5+1 talks, and he's certainly one of the key persons, I would say, behind the Obama's administration's strategy to deal with the Iranian nuclear threat. And finally, we have Mr. William Tobey, a senior fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University. He also brings a lot of experience to this panel. He has served as Deputy Administrator for Defense Nuclear Non-Proliferation at the National Nuclear Security Administration and served on the National Security Council in the US. Welcome to you all, and please, Dr. Chen, start with your presentation.
5 minutes.
You have about 5 minutes. We're going to keep that short so that we can take a lot of questions from the audience.
Good. And thank Asan for kind invitations, and also my condolence goes to Korean peoples for the loss of life in the ferry accident. And you see, the nuclear weapons is a newcomers among all the weapons of mass destructions. And the end of the Second World War, end of the Cold War actually did not bring too many changes to the nuclear landscape. And the very concept, the second nuclear age, from my point, is misleading in a number of ways. Number one, in the post-Cold Wars, we see the very nature of nuclear weapons has not changed. It is costly weapons, and the weapons badly used, and also the weapons could exert enormous destructive forces. And the roles the nuclear weapons has played in international relations has not changed. This is one thing. Secondly, even though the nuclear weapon technologies has been steadily improved, including its delivery systems, the end of the Cold Wars did not represent a watershed in such a kind of technology development. And thirdly, the monopolies of nuclear weapons by major powers, particularly the United States and Russians, remain unchanged. Even though the number of new members of nuclear club has increased, the old nuclear power still work on modernizing its nuclear weapon systems. That's no change. And the fourth point I'd like to mention, the proliferations of nuclear weapons is not phenomenon in the post-Cold War seasons. And it happened before the Cold Wars. China joined the nuclear club in 1964, and France 1960s. And so the number of the newly added powers is still limited. It's still limited, include Indians, Pakistans, and North Koreans, even those we don't recognize the DPRK as the member of the nuclear club. And like their predecessors, the new member of the nuclear club resorted to nuclear weapons in an attempt to address the severe security concerns. And you see, the Indians developed these nuclear weapons on the promise that it will need the weapons to counterattack China's nuclear capacities. And Pakistan's nuclear program closely related to Indians' nuclear research program and the DPRKs. DPRKs has been isolated, economic was weak, and this balanced power on Korean peninsulas decisively tilt towards South Koreans. So these countries need to resort to nuclear weapons to address such a kind of imbalanced powers on Korean peninsulas. And last, in the post-Cold Wars, going nuclear has become increasingly difficult due to the heightened awareness of nuclear non-proliferations and its accompanied threat to world stabilities and regional stabilities. So all in all, when we examine the nuclear landscape in the post-Cold Wars, we don't see many discontinuities, but we see more continuities in terms of nuclear powers, nuclear monopolies, and functions of nuclear as most destructive weapons. So that's my basic ideas. We're going to stop here. 5 minutes. Right?
Thank you very much. Ambassador Chang, I can imagine that being here in Korea, you might have a slightly different take, especially when it comes to new nuclear powers. Please.
Well, I've been involved in denuclearization talks, six-party talks to denuclearize North Korea. And since I have failed in my assignment, I don't know what to say about second nuclear age. But if we define second nuclear age as a significant increase in de facto nuclear weapon states, I'm not that much worried about that. I don't think it's around the corner. But a growing number of countries will be equipped with sensitive fuel cycle technology, enrichment and reprocessing, which can be used in producing weapon usable fissile material. And beyond North Korea, we know that no country is engaged in active nuclear weapons program, but we must expect there will be many more countries which will come as close as 3 months away from nuclear threshold. 3 months is the period after which a breakout from NPT will become effective. So those with nuclear ambitions will try to procure enrichment or reprocessing technologies and will try to stay as close as possible to the nuclear threshold, but without actually crossing the nuclear threshold. I think there are two key variables, key factors which will define the second nuclear age. One is the Iran nuclear deal in the making. Another is a military clash over territorial disputes between Japan and China over Sengaku or Daoyudao. I omitted North Korean nuclear test because this is already given and it's not anything new. And I don't think North Korea's nuclear armament will be a decisive factor in the advent of a second nuclear age. I think Iran nuclear deal will be a watershed in international efforts to contain the spread of sensitive fuel cycle activities. And Iran is, in my view, the last floodgate against spread of enrichment technology to countries which do not have justifiable need for enrichment on the grounds of economic feasibility and energy security concerns. So I think the floodgate will be open, will break down actually in the event that Iran is allowed to retain even a fraction of its ongoing enrichment program in the name of research and development, and in return for freezing most of its enrichment program and foregoing any future nuclear weapons programs. So even if Iran is allowed to retain about 1/10 of its existing enrichment program, do they have 19,000 centrifuges? 19,000. If they are allowed to keep, for instance, 2,000 centrifuges for research and development purposes, I think it will be totally different from concluding different from a U.S.-India nuclear deal, which I think did some damage to the integrity of the NPT-based nuclear non-proliferation regime. But Iran is a totally different case because it is a party to the NPT. And if a country with Iran's level of energy security concerns and Iran the size of civil nuclear industry, I know they have only one reactor. If such a country is allowed to get away with enrichment, it will make absolutely no sense to restrict such right to any other country with a higher level of energy security concerns and more installed nuclear power reactors. So henceforth, any country with nuclear ambitions will try to emulate Iranian model of acquiring their enrichment or reprocessing capabilities under the cloak of peaceful uses of nuclear energy. And smart proliferators can hide their true ambitions and international condemnation for the breakout by staying as close as possible to the nuclear threshold instead of actually breaking out of the NPT and crossing the nuclear threshold. So I think the world is moving toward the brink of second nuclear age without actually getting into the second nuclear age, barring an unexpected turn in international security environment. But secondly, the security situation in East Asia. This was discussed already extensively in earlier sessions. I think the current situation is more conducive than the advent of the second nuclear age East Asia is a flashpoint to watch out. This region is highly charged with tensions, fraught with a specter of history, as I mentioned earlier, rising nationalism, I wouldn't say militarism, but at least nationalism, growing instability associated with a power shift and the return of great power politics, and military clash over territorial disputes between China and Japan is a readily available trigger for nuclear dominoes. And when this security environment and a military clash is combined with the effect of North Korea's nuclear armament, I think it could create a very dangerous situation. I don't think our big neighbors in their right mind, if they act in their best national security interest, there will be no military clash. But I wouldn't underestimate the temptation for both governments to use this territorial dispute card to resolve their domestic political problems when they are pushed into corner. We know many political leaders who normally, under normal circumstances, would be more interested in protecting their national security interests than their personal interests. But when they face crisis of losing their power, and if using territorial dispute can save them from political, crisis, I wouldn't rule out the possibility that, a flare-up in Sengaku, Taoyuan can change, fundamentally reshape the geostrategic landscape in this area. I think the Japanese right, the conservatives, they can achieve all their political agenda, national security agenda, by amending their constitution to become what they describe as a normal country. I wouldn't even rule out nuclear armament. Under normal political circumstances, I don't think through electoral process the LDP can amend the constitution. They cannot. I don't think they can acquire two-thirds majority in the Diet and their upper house, which will be required to amend the constitution. But if something happens over Sengaku military clash, I think the political environment in Japan can change overnight, and that will have far more explosive effect than fourth or fifth nuclear testing from North Korea. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much. You mentioned Iran. That's the best introduction to Bob Einhorn. I think one of the reasons why the US government is so focused on resolving that issue is the fear that there could be a nuclear domino in the Middle East. I mean, there are clear statements out of Saudi Arabia and suspicions about other countries like Turkey that they could go nuclear in the case that Iran obtains a nuclear weapons capability. You were deeply involved in trying to prevent this. How concerned are you?
Okay, I'll come to that. I'm going to address the general question, are we heading toward a second nuclear age? The first nuclear age was characterized by the relative stability of a Cold War bipolar nuclear balance. A second nuclear age would be very different from that. It would involve a growing number of nuclear weapon states, greater likelihood of nuclear conflict, whether by design or by miscalculation. It could involve state actors or even non-state actors. And there are plenty of warning signs that we may be headed toward a second nuclear age. North Korea's determination to maintain and expand its nuclear and missile capabilities, China's ambitious but opaque strategic modernization program, and its greater regional assertiveness, concerns about Japan's very large plutonium stockpiles and its evolving defense policies, South Korea's desire for its own enrichment and reprocessing capabilities, and talk by some South Korean politicians about pursuing an independent South Korean nuclear deterrent. Uncertain prospects for a nuclear deal with Iran, and apparent interest, as the moderator mentioned, by some neighboring states, such as Saudi Arabia, in developing their own indigenous nuclear capabilities to offset the Iranian nuclear threat. A growing perception, we heard this discussed in the morning plenary, a growing perception that the United States has grown weary of overseas challenges, and that the United States is less inclined today to meet the security commitments that it has given to its allies in both East Asia and the Middle East. Virtually no prospect of near-term U.S.-Russian nuclear arms reductions beyond those contained in the New START Treaty, especially in the wake of the Ukraine-Crimea crisis, and no prospect for bringing additional nuclear powers into the nuclear arms control process. A destabilizing nuclear and missile competition between India and Pakistan, large stocks of fissile nuclear materials that remain potentially vulnerable to terrorist theft or seizure around the world, and the risk that increasing reliance worldwide on nuclear energy will be accompanied by the spread of enrichment and reprocessing capabilities. In my view, though, despite these very troublesome signs, a dangerous second nuclear age is not inevitable, and much will depend on whether the international community, especially the key powers, are prepared to take decisive steps to prevent it. I'm going to mention a few of those steps. First, North Korea must learn that its policy of simultaneously developing its economy and pursuing nuclear weapons is doomed to failure. North Korea needs to recommit itself to denuclearization and to take tangible actions to make that recommitment credible. China must finally be willing to use all the leverage at its disposal to persuade Pyongyang to change its course. China has clearly been involved in a recalibration of its policy toward North Korea, but in my view, that recalibration hasn't gone far enough. Second, Iran must be prepared to accept an agreement with the P5+1 countries that substantially reduces its existing nuclear infrastructure and calls on Iran to accept intrusive monitoring measures by the IAEA, and until it does that, strong international sanctions have to be maintained. Third, the U.S. Must remain actively engaged in the security affairs of East Asia and the Middle East, and I would say also Europe, Eastern Europe. The U.S. must reassure its allies through declarations, its military presence, defense cooperation, and other demonstrations of resolve that they can continue to rely on U.S. security assurances and they can afford to forego nuclear deterrence of their own. Fourth, although deterring further Russian aggression is clearly the top priority today, the United States and Russia should eventually seek to stabilize their relations and pursue additional nuclear reductions. Fifth, China and the United States should work toward a stable strategic relationship. This will require Beijing to respect the interests of its neighbors, resolve territorial disputes peacefully and in accordance with international law, and reduce the secrecy surrounding its strategic modernization programs. It will require Washington to address Beijing's concerns about U.S. missile defense and other U.S. strategic programs, and the U.S. should provide China reassurance that it has no intention to deny China a secure deterrent capability. Sixth, India and Pakistan should address the main drivers of their nuclear and missile competition. Pakistan should end the anti-Indian extremist threat operating from its territory. India should limit conventional force deployments near Pakistan that are designed to punish Islamabad in the event of cross-border extremism. And Pakistan, in turn, should limit its nuclear forces, especially tactical nuclear weapons that are designed to offset India's conventional superiority and India's deployments of conventional forces near Pakistan's border. And seventh, the expansion of nuclear energy worldwide should be accompanied by policies aimed at reducing risks of nuclear proliferation and nuclear terrorism. National and multilateral export controls and interdiction arrangements should be strengthened to impede the illicit nuclear trade. The spread of enrichment and reprocessing capabilities should be discouraged, including by increasing the reliability of foreign fuel supplies and pursuing regional fuel cycle arrangements, including perhaps in Northeast Asia. And efforts to reduce and secure potentially vulnerable nuclear materials worldwide should build on the progress made at the recent Hague Nuclear Security Summit, as well as earlier summits here in Seoul and one in Washington. And I noticed that Will Tobey, in the talking points he circulated before the plenum, indicated that there have been dire predictions in the past about nuclear proliferation, but that those predictions have not materialized. For example, 20 years ago, there were 9 countries with nuclear weapons. 20 years later, there's still 9 countries with nuclear weapons, despite all of the dire predictions. And the global nuclear nonproliferation regime has been a lot more resilient, a lot more robust than many experts expected. But today's warning signs truly are worrisome, and we cannot expect the relatively positive record we've seen over the last few decades to continue indefinitely and automatically. And if the second nuclear age is to be averted, it will take persistent efforts of the international community and a willingness of key countries to give a higher priority in their foreign and security policies to stopping proliferation relative to other national objectives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So it's up to Will and Toby to kind of close that round. You've not only participated in the 6-party talks with North Korea, you were also part of negotiations with the former Soviet Union, so
Bob and I were there together.
Yeah, well, I would be interested in your take on what the recent events in Crimea mean in the context of nuclear proliferation, because Russia in 1994 gave a commitment or signed an agreement with the Ukraine promising to protect its territorial integrity as part of a deal where the Ukraine gave up their nuclear assets. So what does it tell would-be proliferators if something like this happens?
I think that's one of the points where we need to strive to do better. I'll address that in the context of my overall remarks. The plenum organizers, I think, were clever to frame this question in the context of historical perspective, because I think it is particularly susceptible to historical analysis. And you might get a different answer than you would if you used a framework of international relations or game theory. So in order to pursue that approach, I'd like to step back a moment and think about how policymakers 50 years ago thought about this question. As Bob just mentioned, in 1963, John F. Kennedy foretold of a world 10 years hence in which his successor might face 25 nations armed with nuclear weapons. He based his warning on a then secret memorandum from his defense secretary, Robert McNamara. And 4 of the states that McNamara cited as having nuclear weapons capabilities later built such weapons. But 19 others did not, although they were thought at the time to have been capable of conducting a nuclear test within 5 years. Today, only 9 states possess nuclear weapons. How did this happen? Why was the first nuclear age as modest as it was? McNamara himself offered several reasons in his memorandum to JFK. He said, and I quote, "The motivations not to undertake programs are clearly strong. They include the high cost of weapons, and especially of sophisticated delivery systems, lack of clear military need, legal restrictions, concern for international repercussions, moral pressures, lack of effective independence in the case of the satellites to undertake a program, and the hope that diffusion will be halted." Diffusion was what they called proliferation at the time. In some ways, the factors affecting nuclear proliferation are even more hopeful than they were 50 years ago. The Non-Proliferation Treaty has proven remarkably durable. It entered into force in 1970 and was extended indefinitely 25 years later. The treaty and the norms that support it are widely accepted, surpassed only by the United Nations Charter, with some 190 nations subscribing to it. As a result, across many regions and even continents, there is effectively zero risk of proliferation. The second hopeful sign, or hopeful factor, is that the United States has built a series of alliances which included extended nuclear deterrence, greatly diminishing the perceived security benefits from independent nuclear weapons programs. Third, proliferation does not ineluctably lead to proliferation. The number of states with nuclear weapons is the same today as it was 25 years ago, with South Africa renouncing its program and North Korea finally confessing its covert effort. Indeed, it is proven possible to reverse the spread of nuclear weapons in the cases of South Africa, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine. Does this mean that there is no real danger from nuclear proliferation? No. The threat of proliferation is acute but limited. With Syria beset by civil war, it is now limited to North Korea, which has tested nuclear weapons, and Iran, which has tested the international community. Although both countries pose serious threats to international peace and security, they are essentially alone. But what of the risk of proliferation, a proliferation cascade set off in response to North Korea and Iran? Remembering 4 points can help us steer past this disaster. First, Iran and North Korea's neighbors have every incentive to threaten proliferation in hopes of evoking stronger action against Tehran and Pyongyang. In short, diplomats sometimes bluff. Second, extended deterrence remains vital to preventing further proliferation. Today, Tokyo and Seoul rightly rely on strong alliances with the United States. To the extent that President Obama's vision of a world without nuclear weapons calls into question the credibility of U.S. security guarantees, it will undermine his policies designed to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. Third, we must do better at balancing non-proliferation goals with other foreign policy interests. In Belarus, U.S. criticism of the government's human rights practices caused Minsk to scupper a deal to give up its highly enriched uranium. Human rights are a fundamental interest, but could we have held off our criticism until after the fissile material was removed? Similarly, the interest of non-proliferation in Ukraine is vital, and Kiev is owed a better response in defense of the Budapest Memorandum than Europe, the United States, and even Northeast Asia have mustered. All responsible countries have an interest, a stake in the preservation of the principles that were embodied in the Budapest Memorandum. Fourth, Pretending to believe those who merely pretend to disarm is not a viable policy. For example, the true tests of a deal on the Iranian nuclear program relate to Tehran's willingness to come clean on what the International Atomic Energy Agency calls the possible military dimensions of its nuclear program, and to abandon covert nuclear technology procurement. Anything less would simply be cosmetic. Now, I would note here that even the most ardent advocates of the deal that seems to be underway aren't willing to defend it as a strategic decision by Tehran to give up a nuclear weapons option. They say, well, we'll need to have tough verification. We don't think that anything's changed in terms of their goals, but we think we can develop some form of firebreak. Well, that's very likely going to be a situation that doesn't result in a happy outcome. Can the center hold? Can the NPT survive? I believe it can. I actually think the solutions are pretty simple. They're not hard to understand, they're hard to implement.
Thank you very much. I think we should continue with a short round here on the panel and then open up to questions. I would have one for Ambassador Chung, because the foreign minister mentioned today in his keynote speech that a fourth nuclear test in North Korea would be a game changer. I don't know what your take on this is, but could you elaborate what would be changed in the game? What would be different the day after the fourth test?
Yes, from my personal perspective, the fourth nuclear test is highly unlikely. Highly unlikely. Because a number of reasons. Number one is you see the six-party talks has entered very crucial stage, and many people believe the six-party talk is rubbish and could not fulfill its preliminary commissions. But the ongoing discussions about the earlier options of the six-party talk still going on between the United States, China, and the ROK, China, and the DPRKs. So we are at the very critical junctures. If the DPRK did something stupid, like the fourth nuclear test, that would bring disasters to the ongoing negotiations surrounding the six-party talk. And that China strongly opposes. Secondly, is, the DPRK has already conducted the third nuclear test. If these countries conduct another one, it does not necessarily improve DPRK's nuclear technology in a significant ways. So in terms of nuclear technology development, the meaning of such contests is very limited. But the political ramifications will be enormously significant, and that will, I think, it's put China in a very awkward situation, because in the past three nuclear tests, and even though China joined international communities, endorsed the United Nations Security Council to pass forth punitive sanctions against the DPRKs, but many believe China has not taken decisive actions against it, and also, as American friends mentioned, and as DPRK enables, China may need to take stronger actions to take all the leverages to influence DPRK's behavior. So the fourth nuclear test will put China in a corner and may force China to take more decisive actions. That will bring disasters to the DPRKs. And finally, the North Korea's nuclear issues is not a single small case. It is a fundamentally important security issues, not only on Korea Peninsula, but also in Northeast Asia, East Asia, and Asian Pacific. And we discuss a lot about to bring denuclearizations to the Korean peninsulas, but how? And if the DPRKs made forced nuclear attacks, and I think that would bring a very negative impact on the existing international regimes, such as the International Convention on Physical Safeties of Nuclear Materials, and also non-proliferations, and others international mechanisms. Stop here.
Thank you. Ambassador Chun, what's your take from Seoul?
I don't want to put my credibility at stake over whether what North Korea will do and whether they will go ahead with forced nuclear testing. But I'm not quite sure whether it will become a game changer or not. We have been threatening North Korea every time they were ready to go ahead with nuclear testing, that this will be a game changer. They have seen it many times before. I don't see why they should be more scared now than before. We know that China is taking a more harsher stance on North Korean nuclear testing. I think whether North Korea will go ahead with nuclear testing or not will depend on two factors: whether they can afford to spend more fissile material, because one nuclear test means one less nuclear weapons. So whether they will reduce number of one nuclear weapon in order to improve the quality of the explosive device. Another thing,
They could also use it to make clear to the world that they have a second source of fissile material if they test a uranium device.
Yeah. Another is, we know what they, we know the people who have seen their enrichment facility, but I think Bob should be better aware about the enrichment. But having enrichment facility is one thing. Whether they can enrich uranium as the size of the facility would tell us is totally different thing in my view. I know that Iran is not even enriching about 1/10 or 1/5 of their capacity, or even Japan, which has far more advanced enrichment technologies than Iran. I think they are enriching Japan is enriching about less than 1/10 of their capacity. So having a capacity is one thing. The capacity to enrich is totally different thing. So I don't want to underestimate North Korea's enrichment capability, but I would also guard against overestimating their capability. But what I'm going to say is that, whether they are ready to reduce one nuclear weapon in order to increase, how they calculate the trade-off between quality and quantity. That's one thing. Another thing, another determinant of their nuclear testing would be, there are other things, but what kind of sanctions, additional sanctions they are ready to sustain. Even though China may advise North Korea to refrain from any further provocation, any additional nuclear testing, I'm sure that North Korea will not heed unless they are sure that next time the sanctions will be totally different from those they are already under. Because the sanctions, existing sanctions, Security Council sanctions, and national sanctions imposed by the US, other countries, they do not really bite North Korea. And we cannot change North Korea's strategic calculus into abandoning their nuclear weapons capabilities or, holding off their nuclear testing. The sanctions are teethless. So if they expect that, despite all the rhetoric, all the threats about tougher sanctions, China will be the first to come out in the front to call for restraint, calm, peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. This means that the message that North Korea takes is that we'll be grateful if you are kind enough to denuclearize or stop nuclear testing, but don't worry about any punitive sanctions that will affect your region stability. That's the message that we have been giving to North Korea. And I don't see any reason why the international community will be different this time. They have the strong rhetoric, but I'm not sure whether that will translate into tougher sanctions, tough enough to change North Korea's strategic calculus. So I'm not very much, convinced about whether it will be a game changer or not.
Thank you very
It will
much.
be a business as usual, in my view.
Let me just go through that and then come back to short remarks. Bob Einhorn, you mentioned the different nature of the second nuclear age and new kinds of players that we might have in the second nuclear age. Might it be enough to be a threshold power to have the benefits, the strategic benefits, that you only were able to enjoy in the past when you tested nuclear weapons in the second nuclear age? Because, I mean, that kind of, if you look at Iran, allows you to avoid the negative consequences. I mean, Iran is already suffering from sanctions, but clearly if they would test, it would be much more severe. So do we have to cope with a rising number of countries that are able to master fuel cycle technology, even maybe without noticing, because if you look at the North Korean enrichment facility, they were able to build it up as a showcase facility, I would say, within 18 months without the US intelligence community noticing, although it was on a site that is certainly closely monitored by US intelligence.
Let me say a word about, just before I come to the other one, on game change. I hope it's a game changer. I hope it finally convinces China that it's got to take very strong steps. I'm like Ambassador Chun, I'm a little bit skeptical, but I hope it really is a game changer this time. On threshold capabilities, I think we'd have a very dangerous world if there were lots of countries near the nuclear threshold. With fuel cycle capabilities, with enrichment and reprocessing capabilities that allowed them to move just to the threshold of nuclear weapons status. Because if you're close to the threshold, your neighbors are going to be concerned that you could cross the threshold in a matter of months, and they will begin to take actions of their own to strengthen their deterrent capabilities. So that's why I believe it's so important to discourage the spread of enrichment and reprocessing capabilities worldwide. And even countries that have significant nuclear energy programs and might have a justification for having, say, an enrichment program, I think they need to think twice about this, and they need to think about how they could ensure fuel supplies for their nuclear power programs without having to pursue an indigenous enrichment capability. And in terms of the Iran negotiations, look, Iran has now, unfortunately, an inherent nuclear weapons capability. It has an enrichment program. It knows how to enrich. It has the financial and material resources. So even if they would agree to zero enrichment, as some countries would like it to do, it could reconstitute that enrichment program before long. So I think the test for the P5+1 negotiations with Iran is to lengthen the period of time it would take Iran to break out of an agreement and acquire nuclear weapons, to lengthen that as much as possible. Unfortunately, it's not going to be possible any longer to prevent Iran from having an enrichment program and therefore an inherent nuclear weapons capability.
Thank you. Last question to William Tobey. You said that I'm going to paraphrase it, that the MPT is in a pretty good shape, given all the predictions that were made decades ago. given what Bob Einhorn just said about threshold countries, do you think that the non-proliferation regime is designed in a way that would allow to kind of limit the spread of sensitive technologies? Because when I go to Vienna to report on the meetings of the Board of Governors at the International Atomic Energy Agency, I get a lot of strong views about the right to use fuel cycle technologies, especially for non-aligned countries. And there are a lot of them that are kind of currently looking into expanding their nuclear power programs.
Well, I agree with Bob about the importance of limiting the spread of fuel cycle technologies. And I understand the point that's made about the right of access or the right to have certain technologies. But I think it really comes down to the notion as to just because you have a right doesn't mean that you always exercise it. Lots of countries have rights to have aircraft carriers. Very few countries choose to do so. Lots of countries...
But enrichment programs might be cheaper than aircraft carriers and easier to build.
It's a substantial investment. Lots of countries have a right to manned space programs. Very few have their own indigenous manned space programs. What they tend to do is, in the case of the former, enter into collective arrangements whereby their security interests are protected. In the case of the latter, they actually participate in international cooperation that allows them access to space. I think you can draw the same analogy to the nuclear realm. There's no need to take away nations' rights, but it is in their collective interest if we don't have a situation similar to the one that Bob described, in which lots of states are very close to having a nuclear weapons capability.
Dr. Cheng, you wanted to reply to
Yes,
one of the comments.
I just want to clarify some of my assessment, because the assessment was not conditioned by the time framework. And I said that the likelihood of the false nuclear test is pretty low against upcoming Obama's visit to the South Korea and Japan, and also in the short term, 6 months, like that.
Okay, thank you very much. So we're going to open up to questions. Please. No questions? Have we answered everything? Please.
I would like to raise
Would you
crucial.
please shortly introduce yourself and...
I'm from Busan National University. I'm Professor Emeritus there. But I would like to raise a very crucial question directly to a Chinese professor. The denuclearization of North Korea has already failed, completely failed, I would say, because it has 10 or 20 nuclear bombs already. But, this country has diversified the model and devices of nuclear weapons. So it's already totally, in my opinion, impossible to disrupt the continuing nuclear development ambitions of North Korea, because nuclear weapons has been considered the crucial leverage to support the national security of North Korea, which might go against first South Korea, secondly China, or eventually Japan. So it is already totally impossible to disrupt the nuclear facilities at Yongbyon. And so, if China judges that North Korea is going to launch a nuclear attack on South Korea, do you think that the Chinese government has some special device to physically deter a nuclear attack on South Korea? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Shall we take another 2 questions? Are there more questions around in the audience? David Sanger from the New York Times.
Just to follow up on that same question, it's been the policy of the U.S. and the Republic of Korea not to acknowledge North Korea as a nuclear state. But as we've discussed here, at this point, the chances of actually reversing, getting them to give up all the elements of their nuclear weapons program or the weapons themselves is pretty slim. So is it a moment to reconsider that? Would there be any advantages to acknowledging that they have nuclear weapons the way we essentially acknowledge that Pakistan does, for example? And does that have any implications as well for rethinking what the defense of Seoul, what the initial American response should be if there is any kind of incident with North Korea of a very serious nature over the next 2 years? Because you'd now have to work on the assumption that they could deliver a weapon, at least in some crude form, even if they couldn't put it on a missile.
Thank you very much. And there was another question over here somewhere. Please.
My name is Eun-suk Chung from Sejong Institute. My question concerned about the UN sanctions on North Korea's proliferation. You know well that a 1618 committee was established in 2006 and expert panel was in 2009, and they present several reports on the issue. And in the report, I've found that there are a lot of non-compliance events, factors, which means the North Korea avoid sanctions in various ways. And I think that they use Chinese kind of Dalian port, and the like branch offices in Dalian and other Chinese territory to make a compliance of their kind of violations. So in my view, the sea changer in the face of fourth nuclear test would be predominantly depend on the role of China. You know, whether it is really possess political will to make North Korea denuclearization through sanctions, or if China used this kind of the UN sanction as just a diplomatic kind of gesture. So I think it's very important. And there are a lot of UN member countries report, in many cases, the violence, non-compliance cases made by North Korea, but China never have submitted that kind of non-violence report.
Okay.
So I think that that's also a problem to me.
Thank you very much. So we basically have two questions for you that go in the same direction. What is China doing to influence North Korea? How far does its leverage over North Korea go to prevent North Korea from either testing or even using an actual nuclear weapon against the South?
Thanks for the questions. And for the question ones, and it's imaginable that the DPRKs could ever dare to use nuclear weapons against fellow Koreans. And I think it's China in the various positions to persuade DPRK to abandon its nuclear programs, even though the previous six-party talk failed. And it failed for a number of reasons. Number one is the lack of concert among major powers. The major powers could not cooperate in a very closely, in a very sincere way to stop the DPRK from going nuclear. If in the first place, the major powers, China, the United States, and South Koreans, and Russia and Japan, could work closely and make determination stop DPRKs from going nuclear. And I don't think it's a DPRKs will conduct. It's a nuclear test, but it's failed because most important, lack of international cooperation. Certainly, some other reasons I don't want to mention. But I'd like to also emphasize it is not good time to recognize DPRK as a member of a nuclear club. If we do so, we're going to sabotage all the efforts to pursue so-called denuclearizations of Korea Peninsula, and it become non-proliferation issues. And this morning's Professor Yan Xuetong's mentioned the Sixth Party still functions as a good platform to stop DPRK from sharpening its nuclear technologies. I disagree with that ideas. In the first place, we still need to work hard to persuade DPRK, even though this country is reluctant to do so, to abandon its nuclear program in the first place.
You already went into the question that David
Yeah.
Sanger asked. I think Bob Einhorn wants to comment on that,
Yeah,
and I don't know William Tobey as well.
On North Korea may never give up its nuclear weapons. I think under the Kim dynasty, North Korea will not give up its nuclear weapons. But that doesn't mean we should accept a nuclear weapons capability by North Korea. It's a very, Pakistan, India are very different cases. It's unfortunate that India and Pakistan acquired nuclear weapons. It's unacceptable that North Korea has done so. India and Pakistan never joined the NPT. They didn't violate, international obligations because they thought it was important to their security to have nuclear weapons. The DPRK joined the NPT, violated it, made agreement with the U.S. on the agreed framework, violated it, joined the September 2005 joint statement on denuclearization, violated it, and so forth. I think under these circumstances, we can never accept North Korea as a nuclear weapon state. We have to continuously work against it, recognizing how difficult it's going to be under the current leadership in the North.
William Tobey.
I would agree that under the Kim dynasty, there is no prospect that the six-party talks will result in the denuclearization of North Korea. And I would add that as a practical matter, the talks have become, or had become, a vehicle for Beijing to modulate U.S. responses to DPRK provocations. So in a sense, the leverage was completely reversed. It would make sense to openly acknowledge that. I don't believe it would make sense to acknowledge or acquiesce in the North Korean nuclear weapons program.
Ambassador Chun, you wanted to comment on this as well, and I'm probably going to remind the panel of the second part of David Sanger's question, which was about defending Seoul in the current security environment. What should South Korea, in your opinion, ask from the US government in terms of defending one of the largest urban areas in Asia that is only some 60 kilometers away from the DMZ, and that is vulnerable not only to nuclear weapons, but even to a lot of conventional weapons that the North has digged in close to the DMZ?
Okay, I will respond to what Bob Einhorn and William Tobey said earlier about possibility or impossibility of North Korea giving up its nuclear capabilities. Well, I agree with you. Under the current circumstances, under the current sanctions regime, North Korea will never give up its nuclear ambitions. They see nuclear weapons as an ultimate insurance policy for survival. They regard nuclear weapons as holy grail of the regime. they want to seek salvation from nuclear weapons. And given the disproportionate, outrageous value they attach to nuclear weapons under normal circumstances, you are right. Give up effort to denuclearize North Korea. Or North Korea will never denuclearize North Korea. But if you compare the level of diplomatic efforts and efforts that you have devoted to halting Iran's nuclear program to what you have done to denuclearize North Korea. You know, the sanctions on Iran, and not just Security Council sanctions, plus your Iran Sanctions Act, U.S. national sanctions, together, they are comprehensive. They touch on all major avenues, channels of revenues for Iran. You know, oil and gas, shipping, finance, almost everything that earns money for Iran. So this is comprehensive. That's very biting. And to reduce the enrichment rate from 20% to 5%, that kind of the level of sanctions, the nature of sanctions that you imposed on Iran would be, I would say, 10 times more onerous than Security Council sanctions on North Korea. But if you can muster or mobilize international political will to do such a thing to North Korea, because the sanctions on North Korea are, Security Council sanctions are partial and targeted on only North Korean, basically on North Korean military sales, which represent maybe less than 10% of North Korea's foreign trade. So even if you capture all North Korean illicit arms sales, that will not really affect North Korea's decision making, even if they get caught everywhere for their illicit cargoes. They have no incentives to denuclearize. But if you can restructure the sanctions in place with a secondary boycott, as the Iran Sanctions Act imposes, then I think we have one less chance to change North Korea's strategic calculus in favor of denuclearization, at least for the time being. They may keep their knowledge about nuclear weapons. They may keep, the textbooks, but infrastructure, I think there is a way. I cannot guarantee, but I think we haven't devoted enough effort to denuclearize North Korea yet, you did with Iran.
You got to make them choose between regime survival and nuclear weapons.
Just we should give them just two choices too, and we keep sending them the message that okay, if you don't denuclearize, it's okay, but it's better for you to denuclearize. That's not going to work, and that's the way the international community has been dealing with North Korea. And on the question that you posed on how to defend Korea, I think since we do not know everything about North Korean nuclear capabilities, we should assume that if they are not yet there, they will soon arrive at the stage where they can deploy usable, deliverable nuclear weapons anytime soon. And that will force a fundamental change in our defense strategy, because we cannot just accept a nuclear weapon attack from North Korea and retaliate. That kind of concept doesn't hold anymore. And we have to destroy all North Korean nuclear capable missiles before they are launched. And I don't want to go into detail, but that's the imperative for us. And all those, there's no guarantee that we can destroy all North Korean missiles before they are launched. Those we miss in this exercise of anticipatory self-defense, we will have to intercept them before they land on our territory. That's the strategy we need. And we need also very close cooperation to that end with our allies, U.S. and maybe whoever we can work with
Well, thank you very much. We've already run out of time. I think it has become clear that the cases of Iran and North Korea will be decisive about how the second nuclear age will be shaped. I ask you all to join me in thanking the Asan Institute for assembling this distinguished panel, and thank the speakers for their contributions. Thank you very much.